All right, so I'm from Washington, D.C., and so I'm part of the problem. We already made some connections upon that earlier. Also, it's snowing in Virginia. I'll just say that because I'm in Hawaii, and it's snowing back where I am, so I appreciate, again, Marlena inviting me to come out here to not be stuck in the snow, because and I'm from Minnesota originally, so any amount of snow in the Washington, D.C. area shuts the whole place down. Not that it doesn't function well already, but it functions even worse in those conditions. So anyway, so thanks for inviting me out, Marlene. And I know that I'm going to give kind of a 10,000 or maybe 100,000 foot level view of things. As you could hear, I'm involved with a national, or actually a global organization, the Water Environment Federation's Stormwater Institute. Again, this is a group that covers 40 organizations across the U.S. and then more beyond that across the globe. And so I'm also, I head up the National Municipal Stormwater Alliance, as we brought together about 15 states, state stormwater associations, so like the Ohio Stormwater Association, California Stormwater Quality Association, groups like that. They never had like a voice at the national level. So again, since I'm in DC, figured we should set up shop for them. And that's kind of part of what I'll be talking about here, is that things are changing, things are evolving. And again, I'm going to be talking about this because I spent a lot of time going across the country talking about topics like this in venues like this. And I will say it's much better being here now. I was in North Dakota a couple weeks ago. And I'll just, again, I'll say it was snowing there and it's not here. So I'll take that any day. So again, I'm from Minnesota. So I'm I guess a music fan, so I was think about themes for talks I give. So I wanted to hang this one on Bob Dylan, Times They Are A-Changin. So I'm going to talk about, again, big picture changes that are going on that I see, and then Eddie's going to come in and actually talk about real things that make sense at a ground level. So you're going to hear a couple different levels of information here. So I'm a pretty simple guy. I think about things in groups of threes. So I'm going to talk about drivers for change. What are the things that are driving changes in the stormwater programs across much of the country? Then I'll talk about what areas are actually changing right now. And lastly, what are the results of these changes that are ongoing? Again, this is just and there's some overlap in these areas, of course, but just throwing a bunch of stuff out there, and I'll pause a couple times to tie into the DOT context as well to make sure that it's relevant for you guys. So. And I did want to actually stop here and mention that I don't know who came up with the Protect Our Waters theme. I think that's a great theme. Again, I go across the country in a lot of these venues and a lot of these events, and that's a great moniker, really, because that's really what we're seeing more as a protection and a restoration of waters, and that kind of investment and ownership taking place by stormwater entities. So the drivers for change kind of fall under the heading of sector maturity. We are seeing the sector move along. Of course, there's bumps in the road. I'm in Washington, D.C. I know it's not a smooth, especially political, ride. So things are not always moving forward at the same time. But because the stormwater programs are led at the state level, local level, what happens at the federal level really doesn't have as much impact in some areas or in some ways as some other types of industries. So we're seeing things move along anyway, and we're seeing the sector mature overall. So these are 4 headings in which I see the sector maturing. Again, these are just me sharing my thoughts. I'm just speaking for me at this point. Under regulations, of course, you have to start here. and I should say that I do, as a consultant, I do work for EPA. Part of my work is for the EPA as a consultant. So, of course, you're in DC, you can't get away from that. But I will say that regulations, of course, drive in many areas, and we're still seeing a driving force on the regulatory side. Again, it's uneven right now, and we'll see how that changes in the near term as the current administration becomes more and more active. But we still see a focus on retention going on. More and more permits that come up have requirements for retention, and more of them are becoming more, I would say, aggressive in their retention. And we're seeing more and more requirements on monitoring. Again, and this ties in with things such as long-term performance. These are themes that we hear more in in the stormwater sector. We also see more focus on retrofits. We have about 3/4, if you kind of do back of the envelope estimation of the amount of developed land that took place, and if you track that with population growth over the years, because we don't obviously have aerial imagery back 120 years, but if you do back of the envelope calculations, you can estimate maybe 3/4 of the developed land all existed before we had any kind of regulations for stormwater. So clearly there's a lot of impervious cover and developed land out there that's contributing to our waters. I wouldn't say impairments. I wouldn't go that far. Obviously there are situations where that's true. But we're having impacts on our waters. And there is this recognition that we need to start addressing what's in the ground now, not just what's being done now. Because if you think about it, there's about 100 million acres of developed land in the U.S. We only have a development rate of about 800,000 to 1 million acres per year. So if you think about if it's redevelopment going to get us there, it's going to take 100 years. You might say, oh, it took us 100 years to get here, and that's a good point. But I think we're going to see both of this happen. But the point is that we're seeing more of a focus on retrofits and more permits as we go along. And I'll just skip down to TMDLs. I'm sure you guys are dealing with TMDLs as far as I understand it. You're not alone. Understanding how that beast fits in with the MEP program that governs or is the performance standard for MS4s is not easily understood, and it's still, again, that's something that's a driver for change. We're trying to understand what that is because we try to understand how a TMDL that requires a certain specific load, how does that square with MEP? It's still not really fully understood. We're seeing a greater amount of understanding. We've got groups, honestly, that, like the Water Environment Federation, just set up our Stormwater Institute 3 or 4 years ago. The National Stormwater Alliance that helped us set up 2 years ago. These are new groups. I think there's more and more of a focus on, wow, we really have more of an understanding of what's out there. We need to start pushing things forward. The bar is being raised to a higher level over and over. I think we can no longer say we don't know as much as we did in the past. There's a lot of technology, there's a lot of modeling, there's a lot of monitoring out there, and we understand better things like retention. I think we understand how that works better than we did 5, 10, 15 years ago when it was really a new novel type of thing. We're understanding the power of source control. That's the real type of environmental protection, right? That's the most cost-effective way to do that. We're seeing groups like California Stormwater Quality Association and others that are trying to address as much as they can ahead of time, even Caltrans focusing on taking copper out of brake pads, things like that. There's more to be said on that. We're seeing that maintenance matters. Again, this is sector maturity. We're seeing a lot of our facilities might have been put in place 20, 25, maybe 30 years ago in some programs. What's the lifespan of these facilities? We're coming up on that. So maintenance is starting to matter, and we're starting to understand we can't just think about putting things in the ground. We have to think about how does it work on day 2, or in year 10, or in year 20. And that ties in, again, with long-term performance. I think we're having better understanding of this, and there's more and more research that's focusing in on that. And a couple other things thinking about understanding is, what are the co-benefits? I'm thinking about green infrastructure here. I'm not pushing this. I'm just saying that we see more green infrastructure going in the ground. We have more of an expectation for things that are greener. And I think part of that is we're seeing social groups get involved. Groups that are looking at things like public health, even healthcare programs. That there's studies that show if you look out the window of your hospital bed and you look at a green scene, you can have a shorter hospital stay. There are actually healthcare providers who are looking at this saying, we want to invest money in this because it's going to come back to us as an investment. So there's more of an understanding of the benefits here that go beyond just water quality. And again, how are our MS4 programs working? We're getting more of an understanding. We're now long enough in our track record to be able to say, how are we doing? When we first did it the first cycle or two, we're just trying to get off the ground. I think we're seeing more of a push for looking back and saying, how are we doing compared to what we thought we would be doing? A couple other thoughts here. The context is changing too. We're going from this view of piecemeal, kind of putting a couple stormwater BMPs in the ground here and there, segmented, separated. Everyone deals with their own. We look at downstream solutions only. That's changing, and we're looking more at the integrated approach, looking for upstream investment, watershed type of investment, regional investments. These are the terms that you hear more and more, again, that come into permits, come into stormwater programs. So the context is changing as well. So these are these are some of the drivers, and just the fact that we call it infrastructure. Oftentimes I don't think we've thought about stormwater as an asset and as an actual infrastructure. We're starting to take this more seriously in the asset kind of context. And same that as tied to asset is funding. We see an increase in stormwater utilities or dedicated stormwater funding sources, whatever you want to call it. Stormwater utilities are the most common, but we're seeing more of a rise. This is reflective of the fact that we need to, more communities are saying we need to invest more in this infrastructure, in this asset. Again, this asset, when you say the word asset, that has something that's got a positive connotation to it. It's not just a burden. And we're seeing that as more of a resource. And again, if you have an asset that you think is important, then you're going to collect data. So we're seeing more data being collected. And again, big data, we're in the era of big data, so it's easier to collect more data. And I'll say non-apologetic needs, meaning we are again, more programs and more states are saying we need to have funding. We need to do more. We need to put things on the ground because we know that the water quality issues of the 20th century really focused on wastewater, industrial waste. If you look at the number of impairments or the percentage of impairments, it's shifted. It used to be a majority, 80% or more, back in 1970, were from traditional point source. Now, 80% or more are from non-point source, including urban runoff as well as agriculture. So there's non-apologetic needs that are starting to happen. People are advocating for themselves. So what's the takeaway? One takeaway that I can think of, and it's tied somewhat to what you talked about, Marlene, but there's audits that are going on. A lot of DOTs are kind of, I would say they have a target on their back, and some that have not done as much, and I'm not making any judgments here at all. I'm from about as far away as you can be physically, so I don't know. But I know that I've spent some time in Nevada recently, in the last couple of years, and they've done a great job. They were audited. They made a great change. They made the kind of the lemons into lemonade kind of shift, and that's why I've got that up there too. So they've become from a program that was audited and it was under a consent decree at one time. Now is one of the leading programs, and I've got some other examples on that later. And I don't work for Nevada DOT. I'm just saying that's an example. I could give you other examples as well. Just wanted to talk about one in this area of the country. So a couple of areas that are changing right now: technology, precipitation, climate change. I'll say that. I think I can say that here. So again, on the technology side, big data, asset management. I talked about that already. But that's being driven by technology. We can do this. Not only is it necessary, but we can do this. And so we are doing it. We're doing a much better job of collecting that data. We see monitoring equipment, UAVs, drones, being used regularly by stormwater programs. And we see that with DOTs as well. Trying to get into places that are more difficult, it adds to safety issues. This is an example of a UAV actually doing water quality sampling in an area in the middle of a lake. That they can save time, they can reduce costs from manpower in this way. So we're getting more data because we have better equipment out there. And I will say real-time controls and monitoring, what I'm talking about here is it's primarily thinking about, we've got assets out there again. We've got 1 million ponds or more as an estimate, stormwater ponds, detention, retention, all kinds. These are passive systems that have much more capacity than we give them. We're now seeing actuated valves and programs that can anticipate storms that are coming in and use this asset in a more comprehensive way and in a more optimized way. And there's a big push for this going on, and there's a lot of different technologies that are out there that are making this happen. Other types of technologies out there, green chemistry. Again, this is something we're finally starting to, again, see what are the impacts of pesticides on pollinators, right? That's one example, but brake pads, again, I mentioned that. Zinc now in tires, we're trying to eliminate that. We're seeing ways that we can green up our environment because that's the true source control, because we're just moving pollutants from our material items into the water, down into the groundwater. The best thing we can do is remove those pollutants at all. And we're seeing more of a focus on that. MS4s are talking about that. Even things like self-driving cars. For a DOT, this is in the future, clearly, but thinking about the fact that maybe we can do things differently in a right-of way that we couldn't do before because our safety and our risk profile is going to be different. There's discussions about that going on. And even thinking about circular economy, that's one of the new terms out here that we're thinking about. So there's examples of the use of biochar, which is just carbonized more organic material being used by places like Delaware DOT. They're using that on the roadway shoulders to enhance their pollution uptake and their infiltration. And this is being done right now. Iron filings, I'm from Minnesota, they're actually using iron filings to enhance phosphorus removal in some of their ponds. This is a waste product from the mining operations in those areas. So other topics, another big, I guess, area is the shifting. I had climate change one time, but I had to be careful. So shifting precipitation patterns, we're seeing resilience being a major driver, clearly. In the Midwest, we're seeing a doubling of the major rain events. We're seeing increased hurricane events and the force of those hurricanes. So we're seeing a big focus on the value of retention and resilience and focusing on coastal as well as inland. And I will say that's kind of associated with this misalignment between stormwater design in the past and where we're going in the future. What I'm trying to say there is that we've had this idea of stationarity. We build something, we think it's going to stay the same. There's been studies out there that show that's not the case in most parts of the country. Whatever we build for the 25-year storm is not going to be at that same level of service for very long. So we need to start thinking, and there's more groups that are thinking about dynamic and optimized systems so that we can get more out of what we put in the ground again. So some examples for DOT. I mentioned Delaware DOT. They've done some work with them. I talked about they're using biochar, which is a waste product, for enhanced treatment on their roadway shoulders. That's one thing, and I could talk more about that. But I want to talk also about coastal green infrastructure. They've got this coastal highway. And it's hard to see all this, I know, but these are available on, as well on PDF. This coastal highway is one of the biggest economic drivers for them. They want to protect that. It's a transportation corridor for them, obviously. So they're using coastal green infrastructure to increase resilience, to protect the transportation system, as well as provide stormwater management. And that's what we looked at, opportunities to do so. And this is being promoted by NOAA, Federal Highway, others, and they're looking for opportunities. So if there's, I wanted to throw that out here, so if there's any folks that are working on something that might fit into this, this kind of area, you might want to look at or talk to someone over at Federal Highway about that. I talked about Nevada and their great program. They're using drones and UAVs in a very significant way. They had a lot of floods take place a couple years ago in northern Nevada. And they used, and this is over here, this interview that's going on, they talked about how they used that to get to places that were not safe for their workers to go to, so they could get a better idea of where the flooding is taking place, so they could be a better agency overall. And they're doing also mapping of their stormwater basins in a more efficient way. So those are just examples out there. And the last bucket here, and I know we're just going up on time, Marlena, so I'm trying to get back on track here, are the results of these changes, again, that we're seeing from this 10,000 or 100,000 foot level. And here's a list of those changes, and I'll just kind of run through them. Again, this is just me throwing things out there based upon what I've seen and heard. I'll start with funding and financing, and the reason I'll start with that is because I talked about the Water Environment Federation. They just finished a survey, the first national survey of MS4s that's ever been done. There's been some surveys done, but the MS4 universe is pretty tough. There's a lot of small MS4s out there. It's hard to reach them. People who run those might also be the folks running the wastewater plant, might be the police chief as well. I mean, there's some small programs out there. It's hard to get those folks to follow up because they're busy. They're busy folks. But we did a lot of work, and we've got a statistically significant sample set from 47 states, including Hawaii. Thank you for whoever followed up on that. What we did is we reached out to the actual MS4 program folks themselves, not the consultants or contractors or anything like that, the actual owners of the program. We asked them a series of questions, and one of the things we wanted to know is, what are your needs in two areas? First of all, what information do you need? Because we work for an information organization, educational information organization, so we want to get that information out in the right way. We can't just assume that we know what you want. We have to ask. So we did. The other thing we asked, what are your needs overall? And we want to understand, what's the funding gap? We don't really have a funding gap. This is, again, part of the sector maturity. And this is we're doing this as a result of the request for this type of information out there. And the number one thing that came back above everything else by leaps and bounds is we need more money. We need more money, and we need to have more education on how to get more money and finance in a better way. Right now, less than 10% of MS4s out there actually use any kind of municipal bond financing, for instance. It's shocking because, again, we can't just do pay-go all the time. We need to think about long-term investments. Okay, so Funding and financing, that's the leading thing. I just mentioned SRF and WIFIA. I won't get into details on that, but I'll just say State Revolving Fund, the Water Infrastructure Innovation Financing and Innovation Act. These are federal programs administered by the state on the SRF program. I'll just say this, that only 4% of all SRF dollars, and this has gone to stormwater over the last, 30 years that it's been around. It is eligible for stormwater. So if folks are thinking about, where can we go to get more money? SRF dollars are usually sub-market. So it's cheap money that's out there that's available. And I just think there's a lot of misinformation about the fact that it's not available for stormwater. It is. So if there's any interest in that, I'll be happy to follow up on that. And beyond public investment, there's private investment potential. We're seeing more and more of an interest from social impact or environmental impact folks. There's this generational shift taking place from folks who used to invest wanting just massive, or not massive, I should say, maximize their profit, which is fine, or maximize their return, again, which is fine. Now there's new investors who say, we want to get a return, we also want to make sure that we do some good in the world. We want to do that in a measurable way. So we're seeing more constructs that are trying to show that there's performance made with investments that have been delivered on the private side. That's a whole other thing. And that's tied to market-based and alternative financing approaches. These are all kind of tied together. So wanted to start there. We're seeing more of an interest in alternative project delivery options. And of course, the first thing you think of an alternative project delivery, we're saying anything that's not design, bid, build. So there's P3s out there. There's a couple of stormwater-focused P3s that have popped up. Something that I'm involved with, so I'll be the first to say that I'm biased that way. But I think that there's a better way to take the limited fundings that we have and get more done. You can increase. We're seeing a reduction in costs of 30 to 40%, and getting a lot more in the ground this way through public-private partnerships. We're also seeing full delivery projects, which are kind of turnkey mitigation. There are more of these popping up throughout places throughout the country. Just basically saying, here's our goal. We hand it over to a private entity who goes, finances, finds the sites, does whatever they need to do to meet the requirements that's outlined in the request. So we're seeing full delivery or turnkey services, of course, and that's tied to market-based approaches. We're seeing, for the first time, a stormwater retention credit market in Washington, D.C. that's starting to flourish. It's been slow in the uptake, but it's starting to go a little bit more. We're seeing other types of credit, type of focused banks and programs and mitigation popping up in various places throughout the country, the Midwest as well. So, and again, I talked about private sector financing. So I won't go through this whole list, but you could probably understand and think about the fact that in the age that we live in, we're having more and more lawsuits. This is the way that we can try to push things along. When I say we, the sector. We see, especially I talked about maximum extent practicable, the MEP, and water quality standards. How do those two match up? There's been some questions on that legally. I wanted to also highlight residual designation authority, which is a kind of a not well-known authority within the Clean Water Act for sites that are causing or contributing to impairments to be required to get a permit, even if they existed before there were any kind of regulations. Well, there's been a ruling that took place. That's as it comes down, and if it's not that followed up by EPA, it'll go into effect, and it could increase the number of industrial sites, for instance, that require a permit in California by 900,000. That's going to go to the MS4s. The MS4s are going to have to be kind of required to take that burden on. So that's an example of what's going on out there. Waters of the U.S., of course, is a big deal, and you guys know about these nexus between the groundwater and discharges and Waters of the U.S. I know Maui's been a big touch point for that. So more to be said on that. I did want to, again, follow up and mention that we are seeing more of a request and, just more and more of a need for, hey, we want to connect with somebody else that's running a program somewhere else in the country so we can learn from them. That's why we set up the National Municipal Stormwater Alliance. And again, I could talk more about that. I don't want to take up that time now because I do want to get us back on track. Again, we talked about co-benefits, ties to water supply. I know LA, for instance, spending millions and millions of dollars on green infrastructure because they want to get more water in the ground. For them, it's a water supply issue. They spend a lot of energy and time and money pumping water in. They only have about 13% of their water is actually local. They want to increase this. So we're seeing that happen. We're also seeing targets set by cities such as Seattle, Milwaukee, Atlanta, saying we want to have 700 million gallons of retention annually. Things like that ties to additional benefits socially, as well as other environmental benefits as well. And even ties to energy savings. We're seeing more of a pairing between clean energy investments, such as solar panels with green roofs, in financing programs. I don't know about stream restoration's done a lot out here. This is not a thing that I've tracked, but out where we are, and it's starting to happen more in the Midwest and in the West Coast, stream restoration being done as a BMP, and not just as something that we want to do to restore our streams. So we're seeing more of a push for that. There's some questions about if you restore downstream for your stream, what do you do with the rest of the watershed? So I think there's more of a promotion of trying to marry up these downstream solutions with upstream investments as well to reduce retention, because you can protect your asset. Again, we're seeing stream restorations occur and they get blown out because we don't do anything but the hydrology upstream. So that's another topic that we see quite a bit. So anyway, the last couple of things, the takeaways for DOTs, I mentioned that there are some P3s going on. Maryland DOT has an RFI that they released on public-private partnerships. They call it public-private cooperative efforts for 3,000 acres of impervious retrofits. This is going on right now. And they have an RFP that's on the street, or it's actually closed right now, for full delivery on stream restoration services. So this is that alternative project delivery. This is happening, and DOTs are leading the way in some areas. And it makes sense, because most P3s have come from the transportation sector. And flow TMDLs. This is another place where some DOTs have been involved. The Virginia DOT was involved with the court case. This is actually my backyard. Acatink Creek. This took place a couple of years ago, but it's still relevant to today, because what happened is they took a sediment TMDL and they tried to make it a flow-based TMDL. And VDOT and Fairfax County, where I live, sued EPA, Region 3, and said, we don't think this is the right way to go. They're still doing some great work in that area. And the judge agreed with them and said, a flow is not a pollutant, so therefore you can't limit it or control it. So they won that case, and that's had some effect on these different flow-based TMDLs that have been out there, but we're still seeing retention standards on the rise. It's just going to come through the MS4 program. So, on market-based approaches, there's a lot that we can talk about. I'll just highlight Caltrans has their SHOP program, where they have a retrofitting requirement of over 1,600 acres. They can do that anywhere throughout a watershed. It has to be done through a method and a procedure. But again, this is something that they can look outside of just their on-site right-of-way area. And we see Virginia DOT. They've got a credit market for nutrients, and the VDOT was the first in line to purchase some of these credits. And they think that they can reduce their cost by 50% by using a market-based approach like this. So in conclusion, we're seeing the sector maturing, and that's driving a lot of these changes. We see technology as being a part of what's helping to facilitate and make some of these changes real, and they're shifting along as of course, we see climate change happening, whether we recognize it as that or not. And we see stormwater programs evolving along with these drivers, of course. And lastly, again, we're seeing more market-based and kind of innovative financing alternative project delivery to try to get more done. So that's all I have. I know I'm a little bit over, so I wanted to try to get through that quickly. And I guess we're going to hear from Eddie now. So thank you very much for listening to me, and I'll be around later on today. So thanks.